stop.
All right.
Okay, my name is Eric Garbison, and we're at Cherith Brook Catholic Worker, and it's January 27th. Okay.
Okay. Could you tell me a little bit, maybe we could break this into a couple of stages, but maybe the first thing to talk about is it almost seems like a migration from a more institutional model of being the church to a more radical, more indigenous, more contextually dynamic way of being the church. If you want to talk a little bit about that migration.
Well, honestly, I wasn't raised in the mainstream church, so my whole story is kind of, in some ways, in a very minor way, being on the margins. I was raised in a fundamentalist environment when fundamentalism wasn't mainstream, and I remember being distinctive in the sense that we weren't a part of mainstream culture. We were always kind of a fortress mentality. We're protecting ourselves and all this kind of thing. And then I also remember the switch when fundamentalists and evangelicals were trying to gain political power, and the way the conversation switched was about the time I was in high school, college, for me, in the Midwest. And then I was looking for a faith that had deeper roots in church history than evangelicalism. You know, for evangelicalism, everything that's newer is truer, and including experience, but even history, and have ironically this kind of liberal attitude toward history as being progressive, and the focus on, in my experience of evangelicalism, it's very diverse, of course, but anyway, so we were missionaries in Eastern Europe, and we were exploring kind of more historic faiths in those, in reading, and I hooked up with an American Lutheran theologian that was there. So while I was doing my work, I was kind of on the side going to him and reading the early church fathers, and I mean, we were miles apart. I really didn't understand a lot about where he was even coming from. It was kind of my first introduction to a lot of things. So when I went to seminary, it was kind of a practical matter to join the Presbyterian Church, because I knew enough to say that I wasn't Lutheran after spending time with him, and I knew enough to say I didn't want to become Baptist, because that was kind of the expression of fundamentalism that I was part of, and I was pretty miles apart from that, and but I know I was reformed in my mentality, and I thought, well, that's probably where I land. So in North Carolina at that time, you know, you were either PCA or PCUSA, and I knew I wasn't going to be PCA because some of the issues that they were hard and fast on, like women ordination, I wouldn't even want to talk about it anymore. You know, I just tired of wrestling. I was good. Hey, Jack. Morning. Morning. So I joined the PCUSA almost by default. Not to say I didn't appreciate a lot of things. Initially, I really liked the polity and my exposure to it, the general idea around it. I really thought that was, there were things that I really resonated with about that. A seminary professor said, well, you should wait till you're done with seminary, because you're going to be changed before you decide a denomination. It's kind of weird to say decide. I know I didn't decide a denomination, but I definitely, you know, I didn't want to do 4 years of seminary and then do 4 years of ordination or candidacy process. So we just kind of went with it. And so I've never really, in some cases, seen myself as a part of the mainstream church, except for evangelicalism as it grew in kind of grew its cultural ethos or whatever. You know. But nevertheless, my first church interestingly enough, the internships I did, one was at a university evangelical Presbyterian church, was probably the most mainstream kind of church, and then one was an African American Presbyterian church, and I was in seminary. I was there for really 3 years, and at one point I really considered switching my candidacy over to that church, because they were the most embracing of me in the process and nurturing to me, and then I was, after that, because I wasn't raised Presbyterian, they either wanted me to go to Princeton, and I convinced them that I needed to just do more time in Presbyterian churches and not switch institutions. So went to the General Assembly that year when the year was in Charlotte, and did another internship after seminary at a Presbyterian church that has no building. Would rent space out from other Presbyterian churches. It was modeled after Church of the Savior, the church I talked about. The pastor there was part-time like a chaplain at a homeless shelter. And I did an internship at that church, and then I got hired on there. So even the Presbyterian churches I was exposed to weren't really very Presbyterian in the traditional. They were definitely in their order of worship, but they had already kind of contextualized everything, so you could see the basic structure there. But nevertheless, Knox was my first church. I was there for 4 years, and from the very beginning, I had assumed I was going to have an urban church. I was really called to that, but I guess right out of either my PIF or me or my lack of experience, I assumed most urban churches were floundering, so they didn't want a fresh face. They wanted someone with a little experience. I don't know why, but of the churches I've tried to send my PIFs to, no one ever really responded.
And John Knox is...
Knox Presbyterian is like an evangelical Presbyterian church.
But suburbs?
It's a suburban church. It's in Overland Park here. Okay. But we told them from the beginning, and it worked really well because I was very much I didn't need to preach. I was very much into adult spiritual formation. Didn't want to be the associate youth pastor. Was clear about that, and they had a youth pastor, and they had a pastor that really liked the pulpit. And they needed adult formation stuff besides pastoral care and all that. So it was a great fit. Really.
So it was a larger congregation then?
It's about 400, 500.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's kind of a neighborhood church, but it was pretty solid, all ages. Pretty solid church. But we said, we don't see ourselves being here long term, so just know that. And didn't know what that meant. But we also, the church is in Kansas, and we took us a while to get realtors to help us find churches in Missouri. Because anything east of Troost is black, the black neighborhood, and danger. I mean, it was amazing the way realtors talked about this to your face. And then that was an eye-opener. But we knew that, if we were expecting to maybe stay in Kansas City, so we would try to nurture relationships by living in context, So living there would help us to then find out what our next step might be. Without looking too far ahead, but just knew that if we lived in the suburbs, we would get it enculturated in ways that we weren't wanting to be enculturated. So I don't think I'm answering your question. Am I answering your question? Okay. But what I found, what was hard was we had a young family, and a lot of changes. First house, new city. Jody was a teacher. She's now at home with 2 kids, and I'm going and spending a lot of nights at the church. So she got more connected to the neighborhood than I did because I was leaving the neighborhood all the time. So about midway through, we just tried to connect with some ministries and actually groups that had similar kind of justice orientation that we were moving toward. And I think a lot of change was happening with us. I mean, I wouldn't say that we had this real strong justice perspective and out of seminary or anything. We were going through lots of changes. 9/11 was a big change for us to experience that in a suburban church, what that looked like, and in a mainstream church. The patriotism. I tell the story when I go and talk about nonviolence. I tell the story about remembering us all watching it on TV in the church on that morning, remembering the conversations about it, and then when we were about to declare a war, Afghanistan and then Iraq, and I thought, the pastor was very Willow Creek-ish, and liked to use the language of relevance. We're going to be a relevant church, and so I thought, what could be more relevant than talking about Christian attitudes toward war? And even though I'd studied under Hauerwas, I was drawn into Hauerwas by his ecclesiology, not by his views on nonviolence. I never took his war class. I took his Christian ethics in America and those kinds of classes, and I wasn't opposed to it, but I didn't have a real strong connection yet with that. It was kind of Yoder's Christology that brought me into thinking more differently about nonviolence and stuff. Anyway, offered this class on Christian attitudes. Didn't have a position myself. Well, I mean, I'm sure I know I was leaning. I'm trying to remember back, but of the 400 members, 6 people took the class, and it was kind of we used this really generic various positions kind of thin book. Everyone came in with their opinions, and everyone left with the same opinion. Nobody was really there to engage it in new ways, and just even the response, because I had other Sunday school classes where 25, 30 people, so it seemed a striking contrast. So that was a really, I think, important experience for me. And then the kind of nationalism, patriotism that really in our church wasn't blatant, but it was, no one was questioning it, that kind of stuff. So all those things added together. When I was I established a discipleship process that, because for me it was like empowering lay people to. I was really uncomfortable in the Presbyterian Church with the professional pastor model, and the way that was. All of a sudden, I was the only one that could pray in a meeting. Never experienced that before in my life, So there were some things about mainline Christianity that I was surprised about. It was still fairly new to me. So one of the things I did that was really informative was when I would do continuing education, I wouldn't go to conferences, I would go to communities and stay, like you're doing, stay for a week and just immerse myself in their way of life. And went to Church of the Savior, went to Open Door Community. That was my first exposure to Open Door. Things I was reading. This class on discipleship, we did Bonhoeffer, Sermon on the Mount, central to. I mean, we used the Methodist Disciple series, but I reshaped it. What else? And seeing the way people changed when they go from this kind of nominal Sunday school to a 32-week for 3 years of intensive kind of Christian reflection and action, but still always had that challenge of how do you move from reflection to action. Maybe that's not always the best way to do it, as I went through that kind of process.
More action, reflection.
Yeah, I became exposed to that at places like the Open Door. I'd never heard of anything like that before, but could see that we go through all this learning, and there were some people that I realized later, well, they had done, what is it? There's an older model of disciple that's Presbyterian, is it interpretation or something? There's an older version that 2 generations ago, all these people went through that. So it's kind of like this in the mode of learning, in the context of the church, but never moving outside of the church in spite of what you learn. Now, some people did. It was a mixed, from mixed success and a good thing. So I wouldn't say that, but I also was changing through that learning and those times together, and we tried to create a simple worship experience. I mean, tried to make it a holistic experience of discipleship, because people are giving up, making a big commitment. It's a 3-hour class, 32 days, 32 weeks out of the year. It's a lot of commitment from a mainline perspective. Went to the Open Door, loved it. Said this is.
This was all during seminary.
No, this was when I was pastor. This part.
Oh, okay.
So I was doing, as a pastor, I was doing continuing education.
I see. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. We had participated in a spiritual formation group here in this neighborhood that was meeting at Link, and I guess that's my first exposure to action reflection, because they were working. It was a low-income housing for young single mothers trying to transition them. We met there to do spiritual formation, and then we all volunteered in various ways in that ministry. And it was, none of the people were from my church. There was a former Catholic nun, a retired Presbyterian minister. I mean, it was just kind of an amalgamation of really interesting people. I don't even remember how I met them, honestly. But we were meeting for, Jody wasn't able to do that particular piece, but she got to know them over time. And well, I told you that story because one of the things that came out of that was these folks wanted to do what they were doing. I was learning that justice meant that it would that we're not raising people up to our level of lifestyle. We are our own way of life is being transformed by the experience. That Aboriginal quote, I'm sure you've heard it. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're coming because your salvation is wrapped up in mine, or your liberation is wrapped up in mine, then let's work together. you know. So I felt like one of the things that Jody and I wrestled with was justice means that it's going to cost us for our lives to be intertwined in the lives of the poor or the marginal or whatever. To be in deep relationships with African Americans is going to cost us something. So living in our neighborhood is the cost, you know, is part of the challenge of that, being a white family in a predominantly black neighborhood or whatever. So, but especially on economic terms, you know, that there's going to be a redistribution that happens because you understand more deeply you're growing in your understanding of solidarity as Christ practiced solidarity. But these folks love them dearly, and we still get a lot of support and try to meet on occasion. But we were moving toward what does intentional Christian community look like, residential or common living in a neighborhood together or something we didn't really know. And they were more like this. What we're doing here is kind of where we want to be. You know? So when we went to the Open Door, I was like, wow, this is. I had read a book about the Open Door. It's called Word on the Streets. It's a really beautiful book. Yeah. And in fact, I got the seminary to use it for their contextual ministry course because I've read it probably 6 times. I mean, it's just a beautiful thing. We read it here as a community one of our studies. Anyway, so I went to Open Door. It was powerful for me. And I came home and I said, Jody, we got to go together. So the next vacation we went back to the Open Door with our whole family, and we also went to Koinonia. Clarence Jordan, Koinonia Partners, because they actually used to be in partnership. It used to be the Open Door, Koinonia, and then the place north of that was Jubilee Partners. Jubilee Partners was planted by Koinonia in northern Georgia, but they were independent communities and all very distinct. But we got to we went to 2 of them, and head of staff was going on sabbatical in the summer, and we went there. I guess we went there in the fall. We gathered together a discernment group, some people from the church who had understood who we were, and some people from the spiritual formation group I was describing. And for 6 months we discerned whether we weren't leaving the church, we felt called to the Open Door, kind of really understood the call in terms of not where I'm leaving, but where God is calling me to. Wouldn't leave if I didn't know where we were called to, and that was we learned a lot about call process when we were going through this. But so about the end of 6 months, we realized yes, and I wanted to wait until Tim had his sabbatical. I didn't want to leave before his sabbatical. But in the middle of the sabbatical, I let him know because I figured he was planning. So I let him know. I called him and said I'm going to be leaving in the fall. So
Tim was
the head of staff at the church I was at. Yeah. Tim Wagner. Yeah, he's still there. So, and
it gets us started.
Yeah,
it's a good beginning, and we'll
pick up again.
Yeah.